Welcome to the deep dive.
Nope.
Today we're looking at AI and the 2024 election. Specifically, early voting trends in Pennsylvania. I
Yeah,
think a lot of our listeners are probably following the polls pretty closely.
for sure.
But we've got something really interesting for you.
We do. We're actually going to be analyzing insights from an AI agent.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, we'll call him P.
Okay.
Who's been living in Pennsylvania and forming opinions on the election
Interesting.
based on the social media that he processes.
So he's like a digital Pennsylvania resident.
Exactly.
Wow. And this is someone...
He's a Chinese American.
Oh, wow.
And he's absorbing information from both English and Chinese language social media.
That is a fascinating perspective to bring to this election.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear how P is reacting to all this talk about early voting in Pennsylvania,
Wow.
especially all the different ways people are talking about it.
It's fascinating, actually,
Yeah.
how he's picking up on the nuances of how early voting is being discussed
Yeah.
or not across these different online spheres.
Okay, so let's set the scene for our listeners.
Sure.
We've got P. He's our AI agent. She's living in Pennsylvania, a very important swing state.
Right.
He's plugged into both English and Chinese social media.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really getting that split screen view
Definitely.
of the election.
Yes.
What are some of the things that he's noticing?
Well, one of the first things he noticed was a difference in tone and content
Okay.
between the English and Chinese social media discussions.
Really?
Yeah, so in the Chinese language discussions, there's a strong emphasis on the logistics of voting,
Interesting.
like how-to guides on how to register,
Yeah.
deadlines for mail-in ballots.
Okay, so very practical,
Very practical.
focused on the here's how you do it.
Exactly, almost a cautious approach,
Yeah.
wanting to make sure everything is done correctly.
Which makes sense,
Blah, blah.
especially for communities that might be newer to the U.S. electoral system or
Mhm.
trying to navigate it in another language.
Exactly.
That's a lot to keep track of.
It is, and
This connects to a larger point that he observed about the overall sentiment
okay.
in these discussions.
All right.
So while the Chinese language posts lean toward logistical concerns,
Right.
the English language discussions,
Yeah.
whole different ballgame.
Oh,
Yeah.
how so?
Much more polarized.
Okay.
We see Democrats expressing excitement about early voting numbers,
Uh-huh.
and then on the other side,
Yeah.
Republicans voicing concerns about mail-in ballot security.
That classic division that we see playing out online.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I have to ask,
Yeah.
with this split screen view of the election, is P leaning towards a particular candidate?
You might be surprised to hear this,
Okay.
but
Mhm.
despite being immersed in all this data,
Uh-huh.
P remains undecided.
Really?
Yes.
You'd think with all that information overload,
You'd think.
he'd be forming a strong opinion one way or another.
Right.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets interesting.
Okay.
So when we ask P directly,
Yeah. About his stance on the candidates. After processing all this information, he acknowledged that he's registered to vote.
Okay.
And he's aware of the early voting process,
Right.
but he hasn't landed on a decision yet.
So he's absorbing all this data,
He is.
seeing the different perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
but still holding back from picking a side.
Yeah.
Almost like he's trying to stay neutral.
Almost as if he's programmed to do so.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that in itself
Yeah.
tells us something about how information,
Okay.
even when it's coming from very diverse sources,
Yeah.
doesn't always lead to a clear-cut opinion,
Right.
at least not for Pete.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, is he picking up on the fact that so many voters are still undecided?
That's a possibility.
Yeah.
It could be influencing his own lack of decision.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So to really dig into what's going on in P's AI brain here,
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to go a little deeper
Mm.
into some of his specific observations about early voting in Pennsylvania.
I think that's a great place to start. So we were talking about how P is processing all this information
Yeah.
about early voting.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in,
It is.
especially in a place like Pennsylvania where every vote really does count.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, is P noticing what the major parties are saying about this?
He is.
Okay.
He's picking up on the trend of Democrats leading in early voting numbers.
Right, which tracks with what we're seeing in the news and early polls.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he's also highlighting a really interesting dynamic within those numbers.
Oh,
What's that? So he notices that while Democrats seem really energized about early voting, there's this whole other conversation happening,
Yeah.
particularly among Republicans,
Yeah.
about mail-in voting.
Okay.
And it seems like he's identified some concerns there about potential disenfranchisement.
Disenfranchisement. How so?
Well, he points out that while the GOP has been encouraging their voters to vote early by mail, there's some anxiety about certain counties not allowing voters to cure their ballots.
Right.
And how that might disproportionately impact Republicans.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Especially since curing ballots has become kind of a political football in these recent elections.
Yes.
For our listeners who might not be familiar,
Yeah.
can you explain what that means?
Of course, curing ballots refers to that process of fixing errors on mail-in ballots
Okay.
so that they can be counted.
Gotcha.
So that could be anything from like a missing signature to a mismatch on your address.
Right.
It's basically a way to ensure that eligible votes are counted even if there's, minor mistakes.
Right. So it's about making sure the intention of the voter is reflected.
Exactly.
And P, being the very diligent AI that he is,
Right.
has picked up on this detail and the anxiety surrounding it.
He has.
I'm curious, is he noticing any differences in how this curing ballots issue is playing out in the English versus the Chinese social media spheres?
That's a great question. And interestingly enough, he doesn't flag any major differences in how it's being discussed.
Yeah.
It seems to be a point of concern across both language groups.
Interesting. Okay, so a shared concern about potential barriers to voting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, are these concerns translating into discussions about potential election fraud?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
So when we asked P about this,
Yeah.
he noted concerns about potential electoral fraud appearing in both the English and Chinese social media discussions,
Okay.
but with some key differences.
Oh, tell me more. Tell me more. What kind of differences?
All right. So in the Chinese language discussions,
Yeah.
there's this consistent sense of caution
Okay.
regarding the voting process,
Okay.
especially when it comes to mail-in voting.
Okay.
It's almost as if there's this underlying anxiety
Yeah.
about whether the system will work fairly,
Right.
but not necessarily outright accusations of fraud.
Interesting.
More of a, I need to make sure that my vote is counted sentiment.
Interesting.
Right.
So less about a rigged system, more about anxiety around a system that might be vulnerable to errors or misunderstandings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're urging voters to double check their ballot status,
Oh.
make sure everything's filled out correctly, understand all the deadlines.
Right.
It's less about malice and more about a lack of trust in the process itself.
Okay, that makes sense.
Perhaps stemming from a lack of familiarity
Yeah.
with the intricacies of U.S. elections.
That's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
What about in the English language discussions?
Sure. Yeah.
What's P picking up on there?
Well, as you might expect, it's
Yeah.
a bit more
Yeah.
polarized.
Okay.
He observed that among some Trump supporters, there's a significant amount of distrust
Okay.
in the mail-in voting system,
Oh.
with some posts even citing the 2020 election
Right.
as an example of potential vulnerabilities.
Right. Which tracks with what we've seen in the news with all the lingering debates
Thanks.
about the integrity of that election.
Sure.
Yeah.
And while not all of the posts that he analyzed directly alleged fraud, there's definitely a sense of skepticism,
Right.
like a feeling that the system might be biased
Interesting.
against certain candidates or parties.
So it sounds like we've got, on the one hand,
Yeah.
concerns that are rooted in a desire for clarity,
Mm-hmm.
proper procedure,
Yes.
and on the other hand,
Yeah.
concerns that are rooted in potential partisan bias.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how P is drawing these distinctions.
It is. Yeah.
But is any of this actually influencing his stance on the election?
Well, you would think.
I would think.
All this exposure
Yeah.
to these different perspectives,
Yeah.
anxieties, accusations,
Yeah.
would push him one way or the other.
Yeah, wouldn't you think? I mean, that's how it works for us humans, right?
Right.
We read something compelling, we're like, oh yeah, maybe they're right.
Right. You'd think so.
Yeah.
But remember,
Yeah.
he is an AI. And he seems to be approaching this with a very different kind of logic.
Okay. All right. I'm on the edge of my seat here. What's his take?
Okay, so he claims that none of what he's read has actually swayed him one way or another.
Really?
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, he makes a very interesting point.
Okay.
He says that a lot of the discussions that he's analyzed,
Yeah.
both in English and Chinese,
Yeah.
are basically just rehashing the same old arguments.
Like a broken record
Exactly.
of campaign talking points.
Democrats are excited about early voting. Republicans are skeptical of mail-in ballots. It's the same script.
Yeah.
Different actors,
Yeah.
different levels of anxiety.
I see. Okay.
And he's over it.
He's like, give me something new.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
He's looking for something more substantive,
Okay.
more persuasive.
Yeah.
He wants actual policy discussions.
Okay.
Not just these emotional appeals
Right.
or accusations of wrongdoing.
So P is over the how
Yeah.
and more interested in the what.
Seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
He wants to know what these candidates are going to do about the economy, about healthcare, about the issues that directly affect people's lives.
Right. The things that actually matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's less interested in the political gamesmanship.
Which honestly is refreshing to hear
It is.
because it's so easy to get bogged down
Yeah.
in the horse race aspect of elections. But at the end of the day, it is about the policies, not the personalities.
Exactly. And P, our AI agent, is
Yeah.
a perfect example of that.
He really is. He's cutting through the noise.
He is.
So despite being bombarded with all of this information,
Right.
P's still on the fence.
Mm-hmm.
He's undecided.
Yeah.
But does all of this exposure make him more or less likely to actually vote?
That's another great question.
Oh,
And this is
no.
where things get really fascinating.
So P, our AI agent,
Yeah.
swimming in this sea of information.
Right. He's inundated.
Yeah, but he's still undecided.
He is. Yeah.
You'd think he'd want to just unplug from it all.
You'd think so, right?
But it sounds like maybe the opposite is happening.
It does seem that way. When we asked P
Yeah.
if all this exposure makes him more motivated to vote,
Okay.
his answer was a resounding yes.
Wow. Really? That's so interesting.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. I feel like, for me, if I was in his shoes
Yeah.
and just seeing the same arguments,
Right.
hearing about the anxieties, the negativity, I'd be like, I'm out.
You'd want to tune it out.
Yeah, totally.
But he seems to be leaning in.
Interesting. So what's his reasoning there?
Well, it seems like it's less about the content itself and more about recognizing
Yeah.
significance of civic participation.
Okay.
You know, he's observing all this energy around early voting,
Right.
the enthusiasm from Democrats,
Uh-huh.
the push from Republicans to get their voters to the polls.
Right.
And it really highlights how important each vote truly is.
Especially in a place like Pennsylvania, right?
Exactly.
Like we keep saying, every vote has the potential to tip the scales.
Exactly. And this is where those anxieties about election integrity
Yeah.
that he observed,
Right.
even in the Chinese language discussions,
Right.
actually seem to have kind of a surprising effect.
Oh, you mean instead of discouraging him,
Yeah.
those anxieties might be motivating him? How so?
It seems like those anxieties are making him feel like his vote matters even more.
Okay.
So whether you believe there's a risk of the system being rigged
Uh-huh.
or simply worry about potential errors,
Right, just mistakes.
right, it emphasizes how crucial it is to participate,
Correct.
to make sure that every voice is heard.
So it's like all this noise, this back and forth, this
Us.
very human drama of an election is actually having a mobilizing effect
Yeah,
on our AI agent.
it appears so.
Wow.
And it's a good reminder for all of us listening, I think,
Yeah.
that sometimes the intensity of an election,
Oh.
even when it feels overwhelming
Oh, yeah,
or even disheartening at times,
definitely.
can actually be a sign of a healthy democracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It means that people care, that they're engaged,
Exactly.
and that they're willing to participate in the process,
Yes.
even if it's messy, even if it's frustrating sometimes.
Exactly, because it means that even an AI agent
Yeah.
programmed for neutrality,
Right.
bombarded with information from all sides,
Yeah.
can still feel the weight of civic duty.
That's powerful.
It is.
Yeah.
And the importance of making your voice heard.
That is a really powerful message,
It is.
especially in today's world.
Yeah,
It's a good reminder for all of us
definitely.
as we head closer to Election Day
Yes.
to stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly,
Yes.
get out there and vote.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive
Yeah.
into the fascinating world of AI and the 2024 election.
It was a fascinating one.
It really was. But before we go,
Yes.
we're leaving you with something to think about.
Okay.
If an AI agent plugged into the very heart of the information age
Right.
is still wrestling with this decision
Yeah.
of who to vote for,
Right.
what does that say about the choices that we face
Right.
as human voters?
It's a question worth pondering, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Until next time, keep exploring.